For this book project, I decided to do a case binding with an exposed long stitch variation. So I began by prepping my paper. I started with 60 sheets of 9 by 12 watercolor paper and folded each in half across the width. It's really handy to use a bone folder here to make sure the folds are crisp, because this is really going to help with assembling and sewing your book down the line. Once all the paper was folded, I began assembling my signatures. A signature is basically a gathering of pages together. In my case, I used 6 sheets of paper per signature and ended up with 10 signatures total. This is quite a lot for a typical hand-bound book. However, I wanted no more than 10 signatures so that my exposed long stitch binding would look clean and not too crowded. Once they're all stacked together, these signatures became my text block. I measured the height, the length, and the width of this text block to determine the size of my book covers. Now, when actually measuring out the book covers onto my chipboard, I added 1/8 of an inch to each side so that the covers would have some overhang to protect the paper inside. I traced out a back and a front cover, as well as a 1-inch wide spine. When cutting out the board, I found it really handy to use a ruler to guide the utility knife. This basically made sure that my lines were straight and clean and that everything lines up when the book ends up being assembled. Once I had all my pieces cut out, I then moved on to the book cloth and paper, which would cover them. So I decided to use a combination of book cloth for the spine and a beautiful Japanese printed paper for the remainder of the covers. Starting with the cloth, I cut out a piece that was about 3 inches wider than my spine and applied a thin layer of glue to the edges. This cloth was then secured to either side of my papers to create one large covering for the board. After preparing my 2 pieces of paper for the front and back board, I could take this spine and glue it down onto either edge of the paper. I had to be careful to glue these pieces together very straight so that my cover wouldn't look crooked or uneven once it was fully assembled. Turning the paper around, I smoothed out any air bubbles. Now this is where we run into one of my largest issues with this project, which was the glue I chose to use. As you can see, I was using a Gorilla Wood glue, basically because I already had it in my home. The paper I used to cover up the board actually soaked up too much of the glue and ended up wrinkling and warping once it was fully dried. Once the cover was completely glued, I placed it 1/8 of an inch away from the spine. This gap allows the book to open and close easily and provides some flexibility. You want to press down here, and then flipping the paper around, I used my bone folder to smooth out the paper and get rid of any air bubbles or wrinkling that may have occurred as you were gluing down. Then I simply repeated the process with the back cover as well. The next step was to trim down the paper at each corner. This ensures that when the paper is folded over the board in the next step, it's not too bulky at the corners and lays perfectly flat. With a little more glue, I brushed a line across the edge of the board. And then I folded the paper along the edge to create a nice crisp line. This is basically just going to help me fold the paper over and secure it with a bone folder. This made it easier to secure it down and use the bone folder to really press and define the folds. I then basically did the same step across all 4 sides of the cover until it was all completely secured. Once all that was done, I got to place down my end paper. I chose a complimentary Japanese printed paper for this, and I cut it down to 1/8 of an inch shorter than the cover on all sides. Once glued, I again used my bone folder to secure and define the cover and the spine. And this is what the cover looks like once it's fully assembled. So because I wanted to do a long stitch variation, each of my signatures required different holes for sewing. I created this template and numbered each hole to correspond with 1 of 10 signatures. My signatures were also numbered 1 to 10 in pencil, so that when it came time to punch the holes for sewing, I simply started with signature 1 and punched the holes labeled 1 on my template. I then continued to do this for signatures 2 through 10 until all the signatures had their unique hole patterns punched. After all 10 signatures were punched, the holes lined up to create the diamond shape I wanted for my long stitch. Next, I used a similar template that was designed for the cover and punched my holes about 1/16 of an inch apart in a diamond pattern that corresponded with the holes in this signature. These templates required quite a bit of math and organizing, but by prepping the templates, I ensured that my pattern would be consistent across the spine and signatures, making it possible to sew everything together. Once all the holes were punched, I could begin sewing with my first signature. So to use approximately the right amount of thread, I measured the length of my book times the number of signatures I had, which was 10. I really prefer to use one length of thread, even if it's quite long, because I like my stitching to look as clean as possible, and this really limits the number of knots I'll need to tie on the inside of the book. The binding stitch is a combination of a kettle stitch at the top and bottom and a long stitch in the middle. I began by threading the needle through the inside of the first signature out to the first hole on the cover. I then sewed back through the same holes and left a small loop on the outside of the cover. This loop is going to be used to connect the thread of the first and second signatures later on. Then I sewed through the second hole in my signature and spine. From here, it's a basic running stitch going in and out of the cover and signature. So once I pulled the thread tight, I went back into the signature through hole number 3, then back out through hole number 4, etc., all the way down the length of my spine. And as I sewed, I made sure my thread was tight, but not so tight that it rips the paper. This is really important because you want to make sure that your signatures are held steadfast in place, but you also want to make sure that your long stitch is not too loose or floppy on the outside. I then basically repeated this process for the remaining 9 signatures. Occasionally I had to use my awl to widen the holes in the cover to help my needle move through. that completed my hardcover long stitch journal.